lectern in front of the Dutch. Stefan Löfven, Prime Minister for the Social Democratic Party. First, you have the floor.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, every girl's body, every woman's body is her own. Girls and women must be able to move freely also in evening time, at night time, in undergrounds and in crowds without any fear of assault. And if an assault is committed, whenever there is an harassment, society needs to be on the side of the victim. I feel great anger when I learn of the reports from Cologne as well as from Stockholm. The perpetrators will be brought to justice, and I welcome that an investigation will look into the detail of what has happened. What we are seeing now, what is being disclosed now, is a part of the violence and the harassments that women across the globe experience every single day. It is part of the hatred we see in harassments of young women in schools and on the internet. And it makes my conviction even greater that we have to work even harder to change attitudes of boys and men, and that the struggle for the rights of women must continue here in Sweden, in the rest of the world, and in that fight we will be standing side by side, men and women, together.
Tack.
Thank you. Next rejoinder has been requested by Jimmy Åkesson from the Sweden Democrats. Please. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven takes his starting point in what happened in Cologne and in Kungsträdgården in Stockholm, and as it turns out also in a number of other towns in Sweden and in other parts of the world as well, where he says that every woman's body is her own, and that society should help the victim, and that we need to change our attitudes and the attitudes amongst boys and men, etc. And this is all good. It's really good that he's saying this, but Stefan Löfven, he doesn't really go the entire distance. He forgets about something. He forgets what is really important in this debate. I believe that I and Stefan Löfven and most of the other members of parliament, we can all agree that this is a new phenomenon, something that is new in our country, something that is new in our part of the world, this phenomenon where you have a group of men in a crowd who decides to surround young women, children, young girls, and harass them sexually and molest them sexually. I've never heard about this before in our country, and I don't know if Stefan Löfven has, but many people tell us this is a new phenomenon. But Stefan Löfven, listening to him and his address, it sounds like it could be anyone. This is the same thing as men and boys and what they do to women all the time, all over the place. But I believe that culture is actually important. Norms, attitudes, values, they are all important. They guide people's behaviors. And my simple, concrete question for Stefan Löfven is, do you agree? Is a culture of importance? Does that guide people in their behaviors?
Tack. Statsministern.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, I feel enraged, greatly so, that women and girls should be exposed to this at all. And it is the duty of society to stand up for the victims, regardless of who the perpetrator is, whether it's a person who's born in Sweden, lived here for a long time, or just recently arrived. Regardless of who the perpetrator is, the perpetrators will be brought to justice. But we need to work with attitudes amongst boys and men to get to grips with this. I am, however, somewhat surprised that the Sweden Democrats suddenly stand up for equal opportunities and gender equality. It reminds me of an evening in Stockholm when one of your party representatives had the made the ill judgment to make the choice to call a woman by a name that I refuse to take in my mouth, and if I'm not mistaken, I think that this was the same individual who then moved around in Stockholm swaying an iron rod. I find it very hard to believe that your sudden interest and passion for gender equality, looking at the measures you're proposing for the budget, really are plausible. You wanted to take 90 billion kroner from municipalities, for example. This is going to be more noticeable to women than anyone else in this country, who, according to Jimmy Åkesson, is going to do the work in caring for the elderly, for example, when our shared healthcare services cannot cope. It's the women. If you remove 90 million, that much money from the municipalities, I can't say I have very much to say in favour of your proposals and your protection of gender equality. Thank you.
Tack. Jimmy Åkesson.
Thank you, Jimmy Åkesson. Well, Mr. Speaker, is this the Swedish Prime Minister that we're listening to? It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. But, well, yes, society has to help defend these women, these girls. Absolutely. But, Mr. Stefan Löfven, to deny the reason, the causes behind this behavior, deny the fact there are structural differences between groups also in our society. Is this helping girls and women? No, this is a very unresponsible immigration policy. To deny that there are cultural differences, that is not helping these women, these girls. These cultural differences that are the reason why girls and women today, when they are in a crowd, why they are surrounded by men, why they're being harassed sexually, why they're being molested. Are you truly defending them by denying the cultural differences?
Thank you, Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, to defend these women, the women in general, is to ensure that that criminals can be brought to justice. And regardless of the reason, the background, or the way the crime occurred, we need to analyse the events and put a lot more work into changing attitudes and mindsets of all boys and men who take the liberty of harassing women, not least assaulting young women and women in general sexually. Regardless of their motivation, we need, of course, to work to ensure that we can shift this perspective. It is never, ever acceptable to harass or molest women. The body of women and girls belong to themselves and no one else.
Tack.
Thank you.
Tack. Nästa replik.
Thank you. The interventions and rejoinders as a result of the Prime Minister's intervention is now concluded. The next speaker for an intervention is Anna Kinberg Batra from the Moderate Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a couple of 100 meters from this building, we have Kungsträdgården. It's a place where can meet and socialize, but not for everyone. For a lot of young girls, this has become a place which is also connected with people being molested, violation, assault, etc. There's only one way of describing that, and that is saying that it's completely unacceptable. No one should risk any form of molestation in a group of people or anywhere else. One should be able to feel safe as a girl or as a young man, but everything else is a failure. Everyone should be able to feel and trust that the police authority is doing everything they should do. There should never be any politics about which offences are reported or not. That becomes dangerous if people aren't able to trust the police authorities. Sweden should be a country where security prevails, and we do not want to see a development, for instance, like we've seen in Cologne, where people are actually been using violence, and this is something that basically is an easy matter. We should never compromise on things like gender equality, safety, security, and ordinary things like you should be able to go out and meet your friends without anyone harassing, molesting you. And if the unacceptable actually happens, the person should then, of course, be sentenced, of course, and punished severely. There's no alternative to that.
Thank you. Minister for the Climate and the Environment, Åsa Romson, representing the Green Party. Miljöpartiet is next for a round of rejoinders. Mr. Speaker, first of all, thank you to Anna Kinberg Batra, who, like the Prime Minister, opened her address by expressing the unacceptability of the harassment of young women and girls. And I'm convinced that Anna Kinberg Batra, like myself, know that this is by no manner of means a new phenomenon in Sweden. We see it in different contexts and in different situations, and something needs to be done about it. But in the uncertain world we're seeing now, we need to have as stable and as certain as a development as possible. To have a planet in balance with a reduction of emissions is becoming an ever more important task for global security work. In 2015, on the basis of Anna Kinberg Batra's intervention, next speaker for an intervention is Jimmie Åkesson of the Sweden Democratic Party. Please go ahead.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Fall 2015, I will claim, goes to history as one of the darkest periods in the history of this country. We had to see an asylum chaos as a result of the EU borders collapsing, not the least because of the immigration policy in Sweden, where no responsibility was taken whatsoever. That was then. Now, finally, it seems like most of us are, at least to a certain extent, in agreement. The situation was so serious, became so serious, that other parties in a parliament that previously denied all the problems having to do with immigration, even these parties now understood that we need to take relatively drastic measures compared to what we usually do in Sweden. Now we have something that has become realism. What was considered to be impossible has now become necessary, and what previously was seen and said as inhuman has become taking responsibility. And this is kind of amazing that things have changed that quickly, and that is what we see now and then in politics, rapid turns like that. And now we're waiting for effects. Mr. Speaker, this means a lot of pressure on the welfare systems and and also other important functions of society. And we need to look at a longer perspective where we also face bigger problems that will erode the foundation of our society. We see the beginnings of this already. We see how we now need separate pools so that we can get away from sexual harassment, where we need separate pools for men and women. We see problems with female managers, and we see discrimination where people are given damages. And we see this today, and we'll see even more of this in the future. The last few days, we've seen a debate that has been characterized by the phenomenon of sexual harassment in crowds. And this is a big problem where foreign-born men surround and molest women. And we read about what happened New Year's in Cologne, and then we had the discussion about Kungsträdgården in Stockholm, and then we have also learned that this is something that has happened in many places in our country the last few months, and this is a new phenomenon. And this is something that is new to us in Sweden and these parts of the world. And obviously, it's something that happens much more often than we've thought. The debate till date has been about different actors, the police, media, and how they have covered the incidents, and who the perpetrators are. And we need to understand that government authorities, they should be neutral in what they do. If party policy action guides what information is given from different government agencies, then we're in a situation that is not acceptable. It's also not acceptable that the police disregard the victims because of party policies. This is not acceptable. But judging from what we've seen the last few days, this is probably what has happened. And unfortunately, this has not been an isolated incident. And now we have to look at the consequences. Mr. Speaker, there is something else. Another component that hasn't really been discussed in the public debate, and that is the fact that this happens. This is something that is happening in Sweden today, in 2016. And the fact that this is happening in Sweden, that is a big problem. I asked the Prime Minister earlier about the importance of culture. Are there cultural differences, and do those cultural differences have an impact on people's behaviors? And the Prime Minister basically said no. But I find that the answer to that question is obviously yes. The incidents, what we saw in Cologne, in Kungsträdgården, in Stockholm and elsewhere where these things have happened, well, this is an expression of cultural differences, and that raises a bigger question about integration. What does integration mean? And when is someone to be considered to have been integrated? If we are to listen to the government and the right-wing so-called opposition, then integration is being defined based on work, whether you're in employment. If you have a job, then you have been successfully integrated. And this means, in practice, that these men who molested girls in Kungsträdgården in Stockholm, they should be seen as having been integrated into the Swedish society. Mr. Speaker, I do not share that opinion. I think this is wrong. Of course, as many people as possible who live in this country, they should have a job and they should be able to provide for themselves. Doesn't matter if you're born here or born elsewhere in another country. And of course, we should try to make use of and validate the skills and the competences that come to Sweden from other countries, but that is not enough. That is not completing integration. We need to do away with this delusion that you're integrated just because you have a job or just because you're doing something. Because culture, norms, values, attitudes are important. And this is also the reason why we see certain behaviors. It has been mentioned in the debate, and this is also something that we've seen over the last decade, where we have come far with equality between men and women. And equality between men and women, that is something that is part of the foundation in Sweden. And if you're an immigrant and if you're not willing to respect this as part of our foundation, but instead you act based on your own cultural norms, then you have nothing to do in this country.
Thank you. That concludes all the rounds of rejoinders, and the floor goes to Jonas Sjöstedt for his address. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of Parliament.
A few days ago, my two youngest children started a new school, and this with switching to another school, well, it always makes you a bit nervous, not just the kids, but all the parents. But they were well received by the new friends and the teachers. Everyone was well prepared, and everyone was happy to show their new school. And I wish for all school children to feel that safe and secure, to feel that level of expectation when starting school, but that is not the reality. Many children have spent the Christmas holidays feeling worried, and they have been more and more worried the closer to the first day in the new school they got, because this meant that they were afraid for being sexually molested, afraid for being bullied. And this was the situation when I went to school as well. the adult world very often decided to look the other way, to make excuses for the bullies, the perpetrators. And many good things have happened since, but this specific area here, I often feel that nothing has happened whatsoever. Time has stood still, and we have to change this situation. We have to be courageous enough to see our children. I do not want our son to be raised into that stereotype when it comes to how to is to look at girls. I do not want my daughter, and this has happened to many, many girls before her, I do not want to get her to hear that boys and girls are to do different things. When my parents went to school, it was banned for teachers to punish the children, and when I went to school, it became unlawful to use corporal punishment as a parent, and now we need to go one step further and help our children. Beginning of this year, it was decided that children should never have to pay for medicines, and we got a raise when it comes to the insurance protection for children and parents. And these are things making children more safe and secure. But feeling safe and secure is also being 13 years old, being a girl, and not being afraid to go to school or to be able to go to a music festival without being afraid of being sexually molested. And we, adults, we have to be courageous, and we have to combat this awful view of how to look at women. And this is something that takes not just the police doing its work and reporting what happens, but what is even more important is that we never ever look away, decide to look the other direction, because feminist work, it actually produces results. In this chamber, we are in agreement. The molestations that have been reported from Cologne, from Stockholm, from other places, they are not acceptable. That is good. But I'm a feminist, and I wanted to combat all types of oppression against women. Doesn't matter who the perpetrator is or where it happens. But there are those who only highlight oppression when the perpetrator comes from another country. The same individuals, the same parties usually are totally uninterested if the perpetrator happens to be Swedish. The Sweden Democrats, they're against equal opportunities for women, and they despise feminism, women's rights. Well, that's something that is just of interest to them if they can be used as a tool when talking about men from other countries. And that is oppression. Sometimes there are similarities between politics and raising children. Sometimes it's about trying to get other people to do specific things. But the same rules apply. Children do not do what you say, they do what you do. When we started with ID controls at the Swedish borders, it was said...
That concludes all rounds of rejoinders on Jan Björklund's address. Moving back to the speakers list, Andreas Karlsson of the Christian Democrats has the floor for his address.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The events of New Year's Eve are now something that most people talk about. A day when we celebrate our belief in the future became a day when systematic and priorly planned sexual assaults took place in a number of places across Europe. We've seen reports not only from Cologne in Germany, but from Swedish towns such as Kalmar and Karlstad. Violence and harassment must never be excused or overlooked. Many women bring with them experience of harassment and assault throughout their lives. Many young girls feel uncomfortable even walking to school alone. Mothers and fathers are worried. They want to protect their daughters from harassment and molestation. Mr. Speaker, there must be a zero tolerance against sexual assault and harassment, regardless of if the perpetrator as a man or men from Sweden or from another country. We've heard from several accounts of the men who perpetrated these assaults have been asylum seekers. They've come here, they've asked for our help, our hospitality, and their actions become a provocation. We construct our civilization on a solid basis of values, a foundation of values, Christian ethics and Western values, which do not only need to be upheld, they need to be defended. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the assaults in the new year, we heard of stories of cover-ups, of previous problems. In Stockholm, for example, we hear from the police that they haven't been open with things that have occurred previously as a result of the origin of the perpetrators, because they took into account any potential political impact of publicizing this information. If that information is correct, how can we in this House make factually based decisions if the facts we are basing ourselves on are incorrect? We need all cards on the table here. I have submitted a question to the Minister of the Interior on this issue, and I look forward to his and the government's response on how we re-establish confidence and trust. Mr. Speaker, we Christian Democrats would like to sharpen the sanctions, the penalties for all sexually related crimes, and if you are convicted for any such crime, you need to be expelled from this country. If you have been granted asylum. We want to protect women, and in this country our values and laws should apply. If anyone who would like to make Sweden their home needs to avail themselves of all the information on these rules and provisions. Otherwise it should not be possible to make Sweden your home. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel commented on the events in Cologne the other day, and she said that if a refugee doesn't follow the rules, it has to have consequences, so they can lose their residence permit regardless of whether they are sent to prison or receive a more lenient sanction. We need to put action behind the words now. In reality, however, it's all about being clear about rules and consequences. That's safeguarding the soft values in society, creating an environment, a context where people can meet each other in community, without fear, without a voice at the back of your mind reminding you to be wary, to be careful. It's about good ethics, safeguarding the value of each human being. That's how we can create a warm, caring society. Mr. Speaker,